At the time, it was widely assumed to be a classic rock and roll death. The 27-year-old guitarist had been drinking on the night he died, and traces of drugs were found in his body. When he decided to take a midnight dip in this swimming pool at his luxury Sussex country home, he got into trouble and drowned. That, at least, is the official version. But fresh evidence in a book just published throws new light on the rock star's death. Author Terry Rawlings claims that this man, Frank Thorogood, murdered Brian Jones after a row about money. Cockney builder Thorogood was employed to renovate Cotchford Farm, the country hideaway Brian Jones bought near the Sussex village of Hartfield only 8 months before he drowned. Last summer, for the first time since the rock star's tragic death, Thorogood returned to the farm with former Rolling Stones road manager Tom Keelock to tell his story of what happened on the night of July the 2nd, 1969.
He was in the bottom, down there, right down the bottom. Yeah, I called out to Anna. Yeah. She come flying. She dived in. By that time, I'd lifted him up.
It was a story Thorogood stuck to almost word for 25 years. At the time of Brian Jones' death, there were only 2 other people with him at the cottage besides Thorogood: Brian's blonde Swedish girlfriend Anna Volin and a local nurse called Janet Lawson. Thorogood said the 2 women went inside the house, leaving him and Brian by the pool. Minutes later, overwhelmed by drink and drugs, Brian accidentally drowned. Police immediately suspected Thorogood.
And they were saying that they thought I'd done it. And that's why they kept me behind.
Without any firm evidence against him, police had no choice but to accept his account of what happened that night. But Keelock, an old school friend, says Thorogood dramatically changed his story 5 months after this film was made on June the 23rd last year.
You know, I went to see Frank in the hospital. He was very seriously ill. He looked very, very bad. And after a lengthy conversation, he said to me, "Tom, there's something I've got to tell you," he said. "I've got to put my house in order." And I thought, "House in order? What's that?" He said, "I'll tell you something after all these years, but you must promise me not to say anything until I die." So, well, what's that? So he turned around and says, "It was me that done Brian."
Thorogood was too ill to tell him more, so Tom arranged another visit 2 days later. But his friend died within a few hours. At the time of Brian Jones' death, it was clear some things didn't add up. Copies of the original post-mortem report were sent for independent analysis by a top pathologist.
Brian Jones was described as a heavy drinker, and therefore a blood alcohol level of 140 milligrams is not that high. Therefore, whilst the possibility exists that he may have drowned under the influence of alcohol, it is also quite likely that he was able to swim normally with that amount of alcohol on board. There was a trace of amphetamines in the urine. It's difficult to quantify this, but what is in the urine is not in the body, so there was no evidence that he was intoxicated with drugs at the time of his death. There is nothing in the original post-mortem report to exclude Jones being deliberately drowned. It is not necessary for marks of violence to be present on the body of someone who has been deliberately drowned. If they were pushed underwater by having their shoulders pushed down or their head pushed down, then one would not expect to see bruising.
But if the confession is true, why would Thorogood want to kill Brian? To discover a possible motive, we need to look more closely at Brian's life. By the time he invited Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to join a band called the Rolling Stones in July 1962, 20-year-old Brian was already the reluctant father of 3 illegitimate children. Brian was clearly determined to live fast. Sadly, he was also destined to die young. When Brian bought Cotchford Farm in November 1968, his career with the Stones was nearly over, as he found himself increasingly frozen out by the songwriting duo of Jagger and Richards. Brian's prodigious intake of drugs and drink and repeated scrapes with the law meant he was fast becoming a liability. 3 weeks before his death, the rest of the band decided to ditch him. He bought Cotchford Farm in a bid to escape from London and the life that was destroying him. The beautiful 16th century farmhouse was once the home of A.A. Milne, the creator of Pooh Bear and Christopher Robin.
Brian was very, very happy here. He fell in love with Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin, and he said he wants to stop here the rest of his life. Little did he know how short that was.
Frank Thorogood and a team of builders had been brought in to renovate Brian's new home. But on July the 2nd, 1969, when Thorogood drove up to London to collect the weekly pay packets, he returned empty-handed and furious. Brian, convinced Thorogood and the other workers were ripping him off, had told his accountant to stop their wages. Still waiting for his £100,000 payoff for being sacked from the Stones, Brian was short of cash.
just drove all the way to London and there's no money available. Now, don't take me from her. Don't tell me to come.
Thorogood confronted Brian in the garden. Brian told him the builders were all sacked and would have to leave in the morning. Thorogood claimed he was still owed £8,000 and wasn't leaving until he got paid. But Brian said he and the other builders would only get their cash after they had moved out. Brian tried to pacify Thorogood by offering him a drink, and he finally persuaded him to go for a swim. While Anna and Janet were inside, the argument flared up again.
Maybe Brian provoked him. He was a very strong man. Maybe Frank's mind snapped. I don't think he tried to kill him. I think it was argument. Maybe they had an argument. Maybe he tried to frighten him, scare him, ducked him under. And it all went wrong.
The first task for Sussex detectives reopening the case has been to trace surviving witnesses.
I spoke to Anna Rowland in Sweden, and she confirms the events of that night. She cannot add anything substantial, only that she could not understand why Brian Jones, a strong swimmer, died of drowning. I've tried to trace Janet Lawson. I've been unsuccessful. I've tried to trace her through various friends. Obviously, she would be a key witness, again, to confirm what happened that night. And I would be interested, obviously, to speak to her. If there was any element of a struggle, there may have been noise, a crying out with Brian Jones, leave me alone, or something like that. And both girls made no mention of a cry. Obviously, they're aware of swimming, but they weren't aware of any struggle within the pool. I've spoken to various workmen that were laying carpets that evening. But there may be other persons that were present in the house that evening during the day that I haven't spoken to, and I urge any person who's got information in relation to this death come forward, and I'll treat it with an open mind.
The story Thorogood gave police in 1969 left many questions unanswered.
Having been to similar drownings in my service as a detective, I would have liked a more detailed statement than what was given at the coroner's court.
He must have had it on his conscience for a long time, after 25 years. He must have lived through something really... If he'd done what he said he'd done to me, he must have been living a hell of a life with that on his conscience.